All right, everybody, jumping right into this week's episode. No intro, no outro this week. Going to change things up a little bit around here. Evolving as usual, mainly because there's been so much up level and change, and there's so much changing in the collective. And the next few weeks are going to be very telling for the direction of where we're all headed. And I'll give you a little preview as to what I'm seeing and sensing. So hopefully that will give you guys a little bit of an ease on your nervous systems right now, because I know it feels real intense. So hang in there. It's all good. But before we get into all of that, I am going to be moving this podcast to every 2 weeks. I've been thinking about this for a while, and it feels right. It feels in alignment with making more intentional and long form content, which is what I really want to be able to deliver to you guys. So having to reproduce content every single week and allow people into the process of what that is great. That's fantastic. But you guys don't want to have to listen to clips all the time. And I don't have a lot of bandwidth all the time to make these longer form, more intentional podcasts every week, in addition to everything else that I'm doing. Hopefully everyone is good with that. But this week I want to talk about how magical and fantasy thinking is a direct correlation to childhood emotional abuse. So I talk about CEA in the second part of the book, in part 2. And another derivative of that, essentially where magical thinking and CEA accommodates, the pattern that those two things accommodate is codependency in relationships. So as a little synopsis, I will say this, and then I want to actually read part of chapter 10 to you that talks about childhood trauma, emotional abuse, and what trauma is. And so you guys can get a little bit of a preview of the book as well. So if you have a friend that has a lot of magical thinking, delusional magical thinking, constantly manifesting, making vision boards, having very delusions of grandeur, they think that they can live this epic life almost overnight, like seemingly they are inherently worthy of private jets, swinging this big in life, having this type of experience, but aren't showing up in any type of action to be able to live that life that they think that they want and are deserving of. That is a very clear indicator of magical and delusional thinking. And that is a response from the nervous system having recorded, I'm not safe. In order for me to feel safe, I have to create fantasy because my environment right now in my body doesn't feel good. This friend, let's say, who's a constant magical thinker, is also somebody who will likely and always need certainty and validation. So they will, let's say, call you the stable, balanced friend who has, or I'll say the friend who typically has more answers or a different set of answers, or just you're their person. You're their person that they talk to, that they bounce everything off of. And you are now always the person that they call, and seemingly their life is kind of always in crisis. So there's a big difference between situational crisis and then having everything be a crisis. And so on the other end of magical thinking, like these really, really high highs, will be like 3 or 4 hours later, almost a crisis, or not knowing what to do, or outsourcing every ounce of power, or having to remind them of the vision that they created and making sure that they have to stay on track with that. And it's kind of this constant back and forth. So the payoff for the friend who's more stable is that you feel validated in your knowingness. You are feeling validated in feeling valuable in this way. You get a ping of dopamine from that service contract that you probably run, or that dark service contract that you probably run. And then they're getting exactly what they need, which is that narcissistic supply. It's really kind of what it is. They're getting supplied with that validation and that certainty, your energy, your attention, and then you're feeling valuable and needed almost in a martyr way through service with what you know, validating what you know and how far you've come. That's the payoff. And that's why it becomes codependent. Okay, that said, I am going to read pieces of the book for you now. This is chapter 10, titled Unraveling Childhood Emotional Abuse, Its Impact on Trauma, Perfectionism, Neuroticism, and Workaholism. What is trauma? Beyond the pop psychology buzzword trauma has become, although I'm thrilled people are gathering language around this topic to help understand their pain, there's still a gap. Sure, we have some context now about the origins of our trauma, but we're still not sure how to reconcile the internalized effects from it. Bandwagon trauma can easily digress into victimhood. In this scenario, our learned helplessness creates more victim mentality instead of the construct of personal empowerment through transmuting pain. However, before I go deeper into this topic, we need to unpack what this means and how it shows up in our lives. When I say that this chapter will probably be one of the most important ones you'll read and that I have ever written to date, I don't say that lightly. It was also the chapter I wrote last. I needed some time with this one. First, I had to work out layers that showed up for me on the topic. And second, I needed to collect and ensure that the data I was aggregating, all the figures that were emerging from sessions were indeed accurate, that over 62% of all of my clients experienced and or internalized some form of trauma, which I define as the lasting impacts of how we internalized a distressing or disturbing experience, physical and or emotional abuse, neglect, and or one-off incidents, death of a loved one, birth of a sibling, an accident, or natural disaster. A staggering 92% experienced onset trauma within the first 8 years of their lives, with a concentration in years between 3 to 8. There's an important note to distinguish between trauma and complex trauma, which is a traumatic experience that happened more than once. For the sake of this definition, and what I saw more often is that trauma, even if it was ongoing, still occurred within the first 8 years of life. Essentially, trauma at its core is stress. This prolonged stress, as interpreted as ongoing danger emotionally, physically, and psychologically, trains our nervous system to this new normal. This establishment creates a baseline for utter chaos to ensue later in life. We become incredibly skilled at being the mediator, at anticipating tragedy, and people-pleasing the hell out of everyone around us. The focus on trauma quickly became a focal point in this research because it was emerging as much more than a theme, but as a collective epidemic. Don't think you have experienced trauma or aren't sure? Let's see how many indicators you can relate to. Common responses to trauma: disturbing memories of the past, including nightmares, flashbacks; avoidance of conflict, constant feeling sense of dread, i.e. something bad could happen at any time; negative emotions, anxiety, helplessness, guilt, or shame; negative thinking, needing certainty, fearful, controlling, or easily controlled by others; time distortions, constantly in the future or reflecting too much on the past; chronic victim mentality, hypochondria, fixer and or people pleaser; difficulties in relationships, especially with trust; tendency to blame others; constant state of hypervigilance; ongoing physical symptoms like muscle tension, headaches, stomach aches, or difficulty sleeping; episodes of anxiety or panic, including racing heart, shortness of breath, chest pain, trembling, nausea, flushing, or sweating. This might be the point where you're saying to yourself, Talie, isn't this everyone? To which my response is a resounding, pretty much. For those of us who have any self-awareness, then many experiences on this list will be checked. The road to healing trauma can feel impossibly long, feeling like an endless cycle of 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, but it is definitely possible. I refer to growing pains as spiritual contractions. They are intense at first, then get easier, and you create more emotional regularity and trigger elasticity. You've got more space to handle more truth because you have less tolerance for bullshit. Unfortunately, however, amongst my clients, from personal experience and research, the most insidious form of trauma is CEA, childhood emotional abuse, or what I'll refer to as CEA moving forward. Healing this is far more complex, so let's jump into that next. So I'm going to take a little break from reading and share with you how I started to unravel CEA within myself, but mainly it was reflected back to me with the work that I saw throughout the years, with recovery, working with women, with sexual trauma, and general lack of trust of men. But complex PTSD, specifically around sexual trauma within their first 8 years of life, is really, really, really hard to unravel from if you are completely unaware that anything happened to you. So I've said this before, when we experience childhood trauma within the first 8 years of our lives, depending on the level of intensity, and depending on what happened to us, there is an aspect of vasovagal shock. Now, vasovagal shock happens when there is backdoor entry. I'll just put it that way. When they're sodomized, when children are sodomized. I know it's horrendous to hear. I did another podcast on that. But even if there is any type of physical or your body is registering levels of unsafety at various different degrees, there's a level of shock that runs through the body. The brain actually fragments, and you are either put into amnesia, because there is an amnesic sac that gets created around the amygdala, which holds the memories. There's either you're moved into amnesia, and or your identity actually splits. And this is where the anxiety is created for a lot of kids. And things like ADHD and ADD and DID is created. So complex PTSD from physical trauma usually is an extended event. So it'll happen in the first 10 years of life, and then a second simulation will happen until that pattern is brought up from memory to reconcile and heal. Childhood emotional abuse comes in through gaslighting, through narcissism, through being made fun of, through insulting name calling or swearing at a child, threatening to physically harm a child, terrorizing or otherwise making the child feeling afraid or feel afraid, hypercriticism, connection avoidance. And this can also happen with caretakers. So if you had, let's say, an au pair or you had a nanny and that nanny was really abusive, but let's say your mother was extremely passive, then you witnessed a lack of power and a loss of power from your mother. So the maternal line for you was loss of power and then dominance for power. So that will manifest a person later in life who will run a lot of masculine energy, has a hypersexual drive, and will utilize more of that, let's say that dark femme to control, step over people. You see this in political arenas, places where men are typically in power, striving for that female to be in power. So usually utilize a way for them to manipulate through control. So if you've experienced or kind of shook your head along while listening to that short list of what CEA can look like, which really is forms of psychological and emotional abuse or neglect. If you kind of nodded along to that, the truth is abuse is multifaceted and it's complex. And it will show up in, number one, how we bend ourselves to please and fit into our family systems. And two, how we anxiously attach ourselves in our relationships, or in an extreme case, how we avoid intimacy altogether. We will try to perfect, which I will get into in a bit, or take out our rage out on our spouses and kids, or work ourselves into oblivion, all to avoid emotional exposure. So let me talk about that. Emotional abuse at its core is going to undermine any kind of sense of self and authenticity. So this is where masking comes in. We will wear a mask. We will protect ourselves. We will create alternative egos, alternative personalities. Our consciousness will be fragmented. We'll move into magical thinking to try to keep our nervous system safe. And then we will perform for love, because if anybody sees who we really are inside, we feel like that will be like death for us. God forbid we give anybody any room to reject us, because rejection is abandonment, and that is one of the core wounds that children that come from CEA have. Essentially, CEA is a nuanced form of mistreatment, often characterized by the neglect of our emotional needs as kids, undermining our sense and security and our self-worth, our self-concept, our self-esteem. Is pervasive, and then it starts moving into areas of perfectionism, neuroticism, and workaholism. And I also talk about that in the book. But once we get through all the perfecting and all the performing for love and all the neuroticism and the hypochondria and panicking about every single freckle we have in our body and all of that, once we get through all that, if you get right underneath at the core of what's really going on, besides the abandonment and the victim, et cetera, it is immense levels of shame. And that is the T. Shame in the nervous system is absolute, total, and complete poison. For me, when I started really unraveling a lot of SA, I had to start with shame. And the way that I kind of counteracted, yes, I can go through and start working on the removals, right? And then the mitigating of all of the secondary waves of emotion that is going to come up, and then the deletion of the reference points and the regulation of the nervous system and the recalibration of the nervous system, right? It's kind of this constant wave of push-pull every morning, kind of working on myself and my nervous system for a while. Then it was like coming right into that shame. It was this pervasive, subtle, gauzy-like fog that was in my brain. It would cause all kinds of waves, like push me out of time, bring in depression, push me ahead and get me into the future. It will be in a functional freeze. So you will turn on into a character for work. You will boss yourself up. You will kick yourself into a certain kind of gear. Like you will literally move into a state change. And then at night, you will be in functional freeze for hours, scrolling. That is a trauma response. And that is, I would bet to say, not just from my own experience, but 100% shame. So because there's shame, you kind of fake a cocoon, right? You put on a mask, you put on a cape, and then at night, it's just this shame that takes over. And it's deep inside the body. And the process that I just shared with you worked for a while, but the activation that I needed to do, the state that I needed to move into was like radical levels of self-forgiveness and self-love. So I'm going to circle this up all together. Okay. I'm going to loop all this together now. Can't you see how there's a sequence of people's behavior? If someone has magical thinking, you can probably correlate that to an early childhood traumatic event. That nervous system recorded, I'm not safe. Survivability and survival patterns ensued. Attachment styles, anxious attachment styles, constant need for certainty, constant need for validation. And as a result, they will attract people who run codependent patterns, who run savior patterns, martyr patterns, self-benefit patterns, and fix-it patterns. So it's like the perfect storm to get into twin flamery, any kind of cult, changing identities, switching identities all the time, feeling lost, not being able to hold a schedule, kind of always having chaos in your life. You can see how these type of people are creating their reality from total and complete disassociation and lack. And also delusion, because delusional thinking will calm the nervous system and is fun. You can just be in another reality. You can live there. You can fantasize. You can daydream. And then when you come back into your body, right, and get into this reality, it feels too big and too scary to have to show up for the life that you want to create. Okay, so go get some paper, go get some, and you're going to write down, if you want, these definitions and keep them in a safe place. Your notes, somewhere where you can refer back to them easily, because I'm going to give you the definition of CEA, delusional thinking, and codependency. Okay, CEA involves patterns of behavior that damage a child's emotional well-being. This can include verbal abuse, rejection, excessive criticism, or neglect, and often result in deep-seated issues affecting self-esteem and emotional regulation. The link to delusional thinking. Children who experience emotional abuse may develop delusional thinking as a coping mechanism or defense. Delusions are fixed false beliefs that are resistant to reasoning or contrary evidence. In the context of CEA, these delusions might manifest as distorted self-perceptions or unrealistic beliefs about one's worth or capabilities. For example, a child who is repeatedly told they are worthless may develop a belief that they must be perfect to be valued, leading an unrealistic and rigid self-expectation. Linked to codependency. Codependency involves excessive reliance on others for emotional support and validation. CEA can lead to codependency in adulthood as a way to manage or compensate for the emotional neglect or abuse experienced during childhood. Individuals may seek out relationships where they can feel needed or valued, often at the expense of their own well-being. They might have difficulty setting boundaries or maintaining a sense of self outside of their relationships, reflecting their early experiences of emotional instability and need for approval. Because childhood emotional abuse can shape cognitive and relational patterns in profound ways, delusional thinking might arise as a defense mechanism to cope with distorted self-views, while codependency can develop as a way to seek out validation and manage emotional deficits rooted in early abuse. So I'm going to leave you with 2 curiosity prompts, which I have throughout the entire book, which are questions and reflections for you to work on and work through as you kind of go through the journey of this huge 3-part in one book extravaganza. Question 1, identify how learning more about childhood emotional trauma has shed light on things you missed as a child. What did you miss? After learning and listening to this podcast, reflect on your childhood about certain nuances and things that were said to you that have contributed to the way that you behave now as an adult. Number 2, how has it affected you in your adult life in terms of your relationships? All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed this new format. I'll see you in 2 weeks. This is a podcast post tag because I realized I didn't give you a heads up about what's coming. So let's get into that for real quick. So first, there's going to be chaos and unrest. It's going to intensify. I have said this before, all the way up until 2030. 2025 is going to be particularly intense. The next 2 months are going to be incredibly intense. But just know that no matter what happens, it's for you to, okay, how do I say this without sounding really crazy? I just have to come out and say it. Okay. No matter what happens, all roads lead to God. This is essentially what I have been told. It has been shown to me, and I don't really get information that way. The information, how I co-create with my higher self, my highest self, is that I am constantly present and I have to create in the moment. I operate off of an algorithm of if, and you'll learn more about this down the road. But I don't really get taken to a council and shown stuff. And it's this, whimsical journey. It is so not like that. I am literally in a constant creation, algorithm creation in the construct all the time. I have to make a decision in order for the next step to reveal itself. I have been asking, why is there so much, I know why there's so much polarization right now, but why can't people just wake up faster? Why can't this happen faster? Why can't this happen more efficiently? And the information that came in was anything that's going to awaken you can't come in and interfere with your free will. We have to be able to awaken through that free will process. I mean, through the quote unquote, the illusion of free will. But we have to be able to make this decision on our own. So the more you awaken and become aware and double down on your spirituality, double down on your practices, continue to invest in yourself, either with frequency work or with your energy and time and things that make you feel good, right? That call you higher, you will continue to see how everything is breaking down. You literally see through the illusion of what's happening. It doesn't matter what party is fighting with each other, if it's Trump or Kamala or neither one of them, because something else happens to interfere with the election. And then the standing VP has to then become the president by proxy, and there doesn't even have to be an election. I mean, there's a lot of that could potentially happen. But through that conflict, we see it. We see that we no longer want to entertain this type of ideology. Look how many people have shifted their perspective within the last, 18 months, 6 months, 3 months. So many people are leaving an old identity because of this mass formation hypnosis that they've been in. They are waking up to a deeper reality within themselves. But no matter what conspiracy theory you go down, all roads eventually lead to God, which all roads lead to the God within yourself. The prediction that I have for the election is that there will be corruption. And the scenario that I just gave you, whereby the election is kind of by proxy, the VP becomes the president because of all these different terms that they've gotten approved the last 2 months, while we have been distracted with very demure, very cutesy trends on TikTok and other things that are happening outside, like the shootings and things like that, that there will be these new bills that have passed in the last 2 months that are going to allow this type of dynamic to happen as subsets to the Constitution. So it's anybody's game at this point, honestly, because everything is predicted by our buy-in into the next stage, the next move. So predictive programming happens like this. This is what's going to happen. And then it happens because these nefarious beings and dark agenda and virus that's in our collective right now has put that as a possibility, probability, and we've bought into it. So the more we give our power away to things that no longer serve us, deep state polarity, separation from God, lack of potential, all of that stuff. The more we do not reconcile our own internal polarity, the more these things will continue to happen until we wake up on our free will. So that is all I'll say about that for now.